Please fail to like and subscribe to Miniature Dog Universe and may have to suffer head loss. Look at this earthling not liking and subscribing to Miniature Dog Universe. This earthling will have to suffer head loss as well. Come here, you.
Oh my god! Let me go right away! I'll never subscribe to that shitty channel, it sucks. Oh my god, just put me down.
Like and subscribe to Miniature Dog Universe or you will suffer head loss.
Okay, I'll like and subscribe to your shitty channel, just put me down, okay?
To show you my method of basing artillery, I've skipped ahead and painted the miniatures and the gun. This technique can also be used for other crew serve weapons like mortars. However, with an artillery piece it's quite large, so I haven't pre-based the artillery. With a mortar, often in 15 mil scale, they're already kind of on a base, but if they're not, I would put it on a small base, kind of like your figures, so that you can paint that bottom of the base and stick it down to the main base and put the groundwork up around it. The point of this basing technique is so that you don't have to get your paintbrush in and around all the figures and the guns, and you can get those figures sort of interacting with the gun to make them a bit more realistic. And you can do this without getting paint all over stuff that you've just painstakingly painted. Or, you know, if you had just not painted this and based it first, I mean, it would be tricky to get your paintbrush in all the areas. So this takes out all of that. So I've painted all of the items, and I've painted the base. I put a dark brown primer on, and I've done my magnetized base. I put labels on my base. You might not, but I do. So I've sort of taken a pen and indicated where those labels go. Before I do anything, I research the gun that I'm doing. In this case, it's a Japanese Type 94 37mm anti-tank gun. Battlefront will be releasing some of these, I think, this month. They're re-releasing their Pacific War stuff with some new stuff, so this might be relevant to some of you guys soon. But again, I use this for all of my artillery and crew served weapons. So yeah, I do my research, see how the crew interacts with the gun, and here's where you might have some problems, because often the gun crews are kind of crappy. So if you can find crews that sort of interact with the weapon realistically, that's good. The gun that I've used here is from Quick Reaction Force, and I replaced the spoked wheels with spares from Plastic Soldier Company. They came with the IG-18 infantry gun, so I put those on here, and they look a little clearer. I also, or not clearer, but the detail is nicer. I also put a black decal in place where the cutout for the gun scope is. That wasn't included on the kit, and I put it together. I guess I could have pierced that too and squared it out with a square file, but that's how I chose to do it, and it looks pretty good. I also added a gun sight and a couple of the support arms for the shield, just to make it look a little bit more realistic. The crews are a mix, so these two came with the gun. We'll put her in the actual camera. These two came with the gun, and so that was the QRF, Quick Reaction Force, and this guy is a Eureka. And I mixed up the crews because, again, some of the crews didn't really interact with the gun well. Here's some pictures showing how the crews sort of sat with this weapon. And I also look into the ammunition style, you know, how the ammunition rounds were painted. So Japanese armored piercing rounds, let's see if this is actually going to be in focus, but these Japanese armored piercing rounds had a white stripe on it. They would also have a yellow stripe in addition if it was high explosive. So I researched this stuff. I'm including in the comments below some links to PDFs. There's a whole PDF on the coloring systems of Japanese artillery rounds. So if you're as geeky as I am and that kind of shit makes you psyched, then here it is. Let's see, I couldn't find like a good ammunition box for this particular gun. So these are Italian for the Bowler anti-tank guns. They're a little different, but they're quite similar. So, you know, in 15 mil scale, well, you know, it's not going to be exact, but it's definitely closer than 0 artillery cases. And I kind of wish that the manufacturers producing this stuff would make the crews look good and give you all the gear that goes with the guns. For some reason, it's like crews for weapons seem to be like a secondary auxiliary thing that isn't so important for these guys. But I don't know, I think it looks really good when it looks accurate. So yeah. Also, if you have questions about the paint colors, I'll put a link below my Japanese armor painting and Japanese infantry painting if you want to look at those. I looked into the painting of Japanese artillery, and you get a lot. You know, apparently there was a special khaki just for artillery, and in some cases there's the you know, the earlier sort of brownish color, and then after 1943 a more mustardy color. So here's a couple pictures. These are the only, you know, actual pieces of Japanese artillery equipment that have some of that artillery light brown color that I could find. So I think what I've got is pretty close, and I think, you know, get it as close as you can. I don't think it's a definitive thing. I think there was probably regulations, obviously, like what colors to use, but also in the kind of harsh jungly climates that they might have been in, it probably got faded, and or it'd be wet, or, you know, there's a lot of variables. Also, Japan as a country at the time, I mean, one of the reasons it's at war is because it has very little natural resources. So, you know, it could be also the case that the quality control of the paint finishes wasn't awesome. I mean, I position the crews and the guns where they would be on the base. So there's always a gunner right by the scope, and this guy isn't ideal for this, but he's better than anything else I could find. Ideally, he'd be like in a very low position, almost prone, looking through the sight reticle. But, you know, this is what we got. And then the loader, which was on this other side, so the tail of the gun is going to go in between his legs, which, you know, normally could make that a tricky basing procedure, but in this case I think it should work out fine. So position these how you want. Often the gun commander is close by, directing what kind of ammunition to use and finding targets and what have you. Ideally he would have had like a pair of binoculars or something, but again, I'm just going with the best figures I could muster from what's available. So I'm not going to place the ammunition boxes just yet. I just place these figures, and what I will do is glue them down first, but not the gun, just the figures. So put them in the position where you want them around the gun, and then glue them to the base. Then I'll put the base work down, and as the base work is still wet, then I'll place the gun back in carefully with a bit of acrylic gel placed under the wheels and under the ends of the tails, and then set that onto the base. Something I also try to do is keep the barrel of the gun behind the leading edge of the base so that the base protects the gun. So I'm just going to push that back a touch, and I'm leaving some space in behind for the rounds. But it's okay if the crews are kind of tucked in close proximity, because that's the way it seemed to be with artillery pieces. Now, there was up to 10 crew, so in Crossfire it's abstract painting, it's abstract basing. So these 3 guys are representing the entire crew of the gun. But I mean, you can adapt this to whatever rule set you're using, or even this even works if you're doing like a diorama in a much larger scale. This figure kneeling over the gun trail is going to be a little bit more of a challenge to get him in place. So what I'm going to do is mark where his base sort of is, just some rough guide marks, and I'll glue him down, and then I'll put the gun back down without gluing it, and then position the other 2 crew, and then carefully move the gun away, base it, and then, like I said, once the basing material's down, then I'll stick the gun on, and I'll put on the ammunition, and I might throw some spent shell casings. I make spent shell casings out of just tube. They're not quite the most accurate shape, but they're so small that it looks kind of nice to see, you know, spent shell casings lying around everywhere, or even just a few. It makes it look like the gun's been in action, which is more visually exciting than not, I think, and just a little flash of brass paint. So just with the same marker that I marked out where my labels go, I'm just going to carefully trace the outline of this guy's base. Just so I know where to set him down. I'm going to glue him down. Just somewhere within that. Just so that the gun will end up in the right position. So we'll move these guys out for now. You have to be pretty careful too at this stage not to scrape the paint, especially on metal miniatures. So there's my rough outline of where he goes, and as long as he's somewhat centered in those crop marks, registration marks, he should interact with the gun, and the gun should face the direction that I want it to face. Then I'll simply take some of my super glue of choice, put a bit on the bottom of the base, and carefully place the figure where I want him to go within the confines of that registration mark that I drew on. And be careful, because once he's down, he's down. So I think that's probably good. And then we'll place the gun. We'll see if he ended up in a good spot. And I think he did. And now I'm going to place on the gunner, same thing, just put the super glue on his base and carefully put him in position relative to where you want him around the gun. He would have likely straddled the trails too with his the same way as the loader, but you know, this figure didn't do that. So my gun's a little forward of what I had before, which kind of sucks, but that's okay. It's still back enough that the barrel will be a little bit protected. So yeah, you've got to be a little bit careful doing this. You can see it's still tricky, but what this method is going to do is allow me to put my groundwork down, which is already the color that I want it to be, and have it all underneath the gun and around the crew without having this crazy painting challenge to do. Now, I will highlight that groundwork around the gun, and the stuff under the gun probably won't get as much highlight, but that works out because, you know, there's a bit of shadow under there, and so that sort of accounts for that. It's sort of already done for you. And now I'll just put the gun leader here, directing these guys when to fire. And that's the first step. Well, not the first step. The first step is to paint all this. Assemble and paint do some research, then get your base ready and glue it down with super glue. I've carefully removed the gun. Once again, I did not glue it down. I just glued down the figures, and I used the gun just to register the figures where I wanted them to be. And now I have my pre-mixed groundwork, which is the color mixed right into it that I used for my base work. And this is the part that's saving me from tricky brushwork to get the gun, or get the groundwork painted in and around the gun. So I'm just going to scoop this out. Maybe not that much. And just start to place it down with a sculpting tool. And I'm trying to get this fairly thin, like thick enough so that it covers the base, but not so thick that it's going to add a lot of height to the gun, because I still have to put the gun back where it was, and if it's up too high, it's not going to sit where it was before. And to a degree it won't anyway. It's going to be up a little higher, so be ready for that. But as it dries, it usually comes down into position quite well. Well, I shouldn't say usually, it always does. So don't worry about that, just expect it when you're going to place the gun back, that it's going to be up a little bit higher than it was before. In some cases that actually even helps you out a bit. So I'm going to spread this out. You guys don't need to watch this, and I'll come back when it's time to place the gun. Now the basing material has been added, and it's still quite wet, so I'm going to let this dry for a good hour. It's still going to be wet, but it's going to lose some of its volume. It's going to start to shrink down as it dries out, which is what I want. I want to put the gun on when it's still wet. I'm going to put acrylic gel medium on the bottoms of the wheels and on the bottom of the trails, and that'll press right into the wet groundwork, and it'll all dry together nice and solid. And the acrylic gel, it's sort of plasticky, so it's not a brittle, it's not brittle basically. So if you drop it, there's a chance that the gun won't even fall off. And I actually have dropped some of these before, believe it or not, with some help of my fine furry friend Tony the cat, and they've survived. Yeah, so that's a good thing. Something else I'll mention is the space between the loader's legs, where the gun trail is going to pass through. I didn't put any of the groundwork. I've left that void just to facilitate the ease of that gun trail coming through. Plus it's going to have a little daub of acrylic gel underneath it to place in the ground. So I don't want to get that smeared off into the groundwork. So that'll make that nice and smooth. And that space is so small, and a lot of it will be taken up with the gun trail. Oops, I just messed up my groundwork. That, I thought that would be an easier way to do it. Plus, as you might have seen in my basing tutorial, and I'll also add the link if you didn't see it yet, I paint the bases of my soldiers the same color that I add to my groundwork, so that it blends in quite nicely. You won't even notice, really, I don't think. I've let the basing material dry for about an hour and 20 minutes, and so it's still wet, but again, the volume has reduced quite a bit. So now I'm going to take my trusty golden soft gel medium, which is what I use for all of my terrain stuff, as an adhesive, but it also is almost like a matte varnish. I think the Liquitex gel mediums are probably just as good, but this is a good one, and this is what I'll use to stick the gun down. So we'll get our base into play, and I'll also use it to stick down these. While this is still wet, and it will all dry sort of together, and this stuff has a very good adhesive bond. So I'm going to take the artillery piece, get these guys out of the way, and I'm just going to put a little dab on the bottom. If there's excess, we can just brush it out a bit later once the gun is in place. I'm going to put some on the ends of the trails there under the spades. It's probably out of focus, sorry. There. You get the point though. And you don't need to be super quick, but you don't want to be ridiculous slow. So now we're going to carefully put the gun into position between this guy's legs. I'm going to try not to push up all the groundwork with it, but if some pushes up too, we can always do a little bit more work with our dental or sculpting tool. I feel like I need to move this a bit. So it's going to take a little bit of manipulation, but we should be able to get it. There's something under here. Get it back to the position where we started, which is probably about like this. I feel like some of the soft gel came off too before it got to where it is, so I'm just going to take my brush and add a bit more around these, add some more around the tires, or not the tires, they're wheels, you know what I mean. This is the spoked wheel variant. They eventually replaced it with an all-metal wheel because the spoked wheels were very noisy when they were being moved. I might use a bit of water to sort of make that a bit more runny. The wheels sink in a little bit to the groundwork, but not that much. It's not a very heavy artillery piece, so you don't want it to sink in too much. And now, here you can see that it actually pushed the groundwork back in a little hump, but that's actually kind of good, because that's what would happen. The recoil of the gun would almost, the spade at the back is sort of dug into the ground, and as it fires, it would push that up. And so I'm just going to almost bring it back like a little ditch that's being dug as a result of the gun firing. And I'm going to do it on the other side too. And that just adds to the realism of the overall item at the end. So it looks like the gun is sitting fairly well. It might be a little bit higher on one side than the other, but I really think when they dry it kind of levels out. So, and even if it doesn't, you know, the ground isn't level either, so I wouldn't get too bent out of shape about that. So I'm just going to add some water to where this gel is really showing quite white and murky, just so that it doesn't dry that way. And there you have it. It's down, there's groundwork all around it, and underneath it, it's already the color that it needs to be. So then you don't have to try and paint in and around all of this. It's already done. And when you highlight the groundwork with dry brushing around it, you know, it'll create like a natural shadow around the figures in the gun. So now we're going to go on to the ammunition, and I'm going to add that exactly the same way as I added the gun. We'll just take the ammo, and on the back I'm going to put a gob of the acrylic gel. Let's do this in the actual camera. So as you see, I've just put an actual gob of the acrylic gel, and then I'm going to place this somewhere relevant to where it would be placed on the gun. Close to the loader, I would think. And just give it a little press into the groundwork. And then I'm going to put the closed up case nearby as well, just sort of at the ready. So as you can see, I've added some to this, and once again Just press that in to the groundwork. And when that all dries, it's going to be well stuck into place. And then we can put any like foliage or groundwork on, like, you know, in the jungle I might do some dead leaves. I'm going to put, you know, like a bush that kind of looks like the camouflage in their helmets in front of the gun. The Japanese were sort of on the offensive. I'm doing like a Dutch East Indies project. So, you know, they would have just placed this gun somewhere where they would have sight at the enemy and not necessarily had a bunch of time to dig a proper gun position and, you know, fired. So I'll come back when I put the rest of that stuff on. Also, if you wanted to add some rocks, I might even add a couple of rocks. Most of my bases have some rocks, so now that I know the rocks that I add aren't going to interfere with the gun in any sort of way, I can add them now. I'm using some of these decorative dollar store rocks. They're silver in color, so I'll go and paint them later, but I can place them somewhere where I'll easily be able to paint them and not, you know, be in danger of painting the gun or getting paint on the crew figures. Just a few little rocks to add some interest to the base. There. And that's it. We'll let that dry totally, and then we'll move on to the next phase of gun basing. Now the groundwork has hardened and dried, so everything is down, everything is quite well adhered. I'm just going to go through with some of the acrylic gel, water it down, and just paint a little around the rocks and maybe some more just around the wheels and the trails of the gun. And that should keep it pretty well pegged down. I've yet to have one fall off the base, so it should be the kind of smashing miniature dork success story that we've all come to expect. Or I don't know if we have much expectation from something called Miniature Dork Universe, but hey, it's all in good fun. So yeah, I'm just putting a bit more of the acrylic gel. It's probably a little bit on the overkill side of things, but I always say that I would rather be overkill than underkill. And so I've added that on. I'm going to let that dry, and then I'm going to take my charcoal gray, which is the color, which is actually kind of a dark grayish brown, and I'm going to paint everything in with the charcoal gray. I'll probably paint the rocks individually, do some dry brushing, put my labels on, and put on some some tufts and things like that. Give it a sort of jungly looking theme. So I won't go through all of that, but I'll leave links to my videos in the comments below that do deal with things like making labels, making jungle bases, yada yada yada. And yeah, so I'll come back when I have those things done and you can see the final result. But you know, the point I'm trying to get across is that this is a method that you can do where all of the groundwork is in and around the gun and the figures, which are quite tightly compacted, and you want them that way because that's the way that's the most realistic. They're operating a small gun in a combat, you know, situation. Yeah, so it's in fairly tight. You know, any other way of doing this would be very difficult to paint in and around the gun and the figures. This way it made it actually quite easy. I was just able to paint the gun and the figures separately, stick down the figures where they sit in relation to the gun, put down the groundwork, and then put the gun in position once that was done. And seeing as the groundwork was pre-colored, then that alleviates me having to try and paint that around these guys. So yeah, I'll bring it back when it's ready for, well, when it's done and finalized, and have a few closing stupid statements that are probably irrelevant, but we'll put them in there anyway. And yeah, that's how it's going to go. Alright, there we have it. I've put all the basing materials and my labels down, and this is how the artillery pieces look, based this way. So that'll pretty much wrap it up. Again, I'll do my gallery of stills at the end so you can see various artillery pieces, all of them based the same way. I will also add links in the comments below, videos on how to do the labels for the bases, painting Japanese infantry and painting Japanese armor. These videos cover sort of the early period, so these colors may have changed when you're getting into the sort of era when they're fighting, doing the island hopping campaigns, or later on in Burma. So do a little research there, but my videos sort of cover that early sort of Japanese blitzkrieg period where they just overran most of the Pacific. So yeah, this kind of coincides with this month too. Flames of War are going to release or re-release all their Pacific stuff and add some new things, so this might help you for some of that, although I think their period's going to be more like mid to late. Here is, as I mentioned, this is the 40 represents the armor penetration at 500 meters. So in Crossfire, the table represents no more than 500 meters. So any tank is vulnerable to this that has, you know, under 40 millimeters of armor, which is just about every Allied tank at that period, like the Vickers tanks, and I'm not even sure if the British had cruisers in Malaya or Singapore, but all the tanks that the KNIL use have like 13 millimeter armor. I think the only tank in theater at the time that wasn't super vulnerable was the Stuart tanks. I think they had 50 millimeters frontal armor, but the side armor and rear armor would have been vulnerable too, so you can deploy these accordingly. And what else can I say about this before I close? I added some spent artillery shell casings. That's just made out of tube that I hollowed out and fired down on the base to make it look like the gun is in action a little more. When you're placing the gun in cover on your bases, kind of make sure that you keep the sight aperture open, you know, because obviously they need to see to fire. So it's just one of those nerdy things that someone might pick up on. And also try to keep the area where the crew's fighting clear. I've made mine kind of messy, you know. It's a bit of artistic license here, but probably the unopened ammunition case wouldn't be behind where these guys are going to be moving around and fighting. And these squads had, you know, up to 10 to 12 guys running ammunition back and forth. So I imagine they would have had an open ammunition box, and then the rest would have been fairly clear. But again, you can use a little artistic license, especially when you've got limited space to sort of, you know, give the impression of what this thing was like. So yeah, that's about it. So if you have any questions about painting or whatever, or labels, just check it out in the comments below. And we'll see you next time for another round of Miniature Dork Universe.